let's break down Modern Warfare's M4A1. The M4A1 was always one of the best weapons you could use, especially at the beginning where it was meta. Whether you were using with no stock or with other attachments. We were still using them with iron sights, and some people would use them with VLKs. But once we started using the Growl, ranges just started getting longer and longer. The thing is, the M4 never really got nerfed. Yeah, it got a major change a few months ago, but other than that, it was pretty much the same. But even though I don't bring it with me, I pick it up every so often and man, it feels great. So let's actually look at the stats and see how it actually compares against the Warzone meta. In this build, we're using the monolithic suppressor, the Corvus custom marksman barrel, tac laser, VLK 3.0 times optic, and the 60 round mags. Now let's get into the stats, starting with mobility. It has a pretty average ADS time of 280 milliseconds. Its reload and reload add times are 2.36 from empty and 2.24 if you leave one bullet in the mag. And it's got a mag cap of 60. When looking at its movement and sprint speeds, it is average, but this is actually better than usual for long-range weapons. But its ADS straight speed is 1.87 meters per second, which is right around where we would expect. Its sprint out and tac sprint out times are at 270 and 370 milliseconds, which is average again. And its stability is at 2T, which isn't the greatest, but we won't be stretching the ranges that far. Its bullet velocity is 1,143 meters per second, which is pretty good, and its rate of fire is 13.5 rounds per second or 810 rounds per minute, and that is pretty good for a long-range weapon. So it gets a mobility score of 34. Its recoil pattern looks pretty easy. It goes up and then goes diagonally to the right. However, it has quite a lot of visual recoil and a lot of side-to-side bouncing. And while side-to-side bouncing is great to compress recoil, when you actually start stretching out the range, the side-to-side bounce can actually be wider than a person's width, but we can reliably use it to 90 meters, so it gets a recoil score of 38. Now for its damage, it has a drop-off point at 41 meters. In the first damage range, it has a pretty bad headshot TTK, and for the rest, a below average one. And in the second damage range, it has a below average TTK for headshots, but upper torso, lower torso, and limb has an average TTK. And as we know, an above average TTK for a long range weapon is pretty good. However, its below average TTKs in the first damage range isn't the best, but at least it has an extra 10 meters than some other weapons out there. However, if you can get one headshot in the mix, and it's pretty easy to do so, you can get an above average TTK. And this is part of what makes the M4 feel so good. Up close, you can get a pretty great TTK, and at range, you're still getting a pretty good one too. As long as you're hitting your shots, you'll have the ability to beat many of your enemies. So it gets a damage score of 45. And when we add up all the categories, it gets a final score of 117. This score is a little lower than I expected, but it kinda makes sense in the end. It's not a Cold War weapon, so its mobility score isn't that great. And while its recoil is pretty good, due to that side-to-side bouncing, it just can't be used that far. And while its potential for TTK is pretty good, individually, the scores aren't that special. So when we add up all together, it doesn't seem that great, especially since it's not getting any bonus points for the +1 headshot TTK. But when we use it, it's good enough. For mobility, you're probably going to be using a speedy sidearm anyways, whether it's an SMG or a pistol, so it doesn't matter that much. And the rest of the stats are good enough. Sure, you're going to have to get a little bit closer, which means you won't be having a super far engagement weapon, but honestly, how often do you get into a fight that is longer than 100 meters and still win? Especially now that many of the assault rifles like the EM2 are bringing down their ranges way lower, so they're around 100 meters anyways. Sure, there's still weapons like the M13, Kilo, and Krig, but those won't be doing as much damage. You'll still be losing to things like the MG82, but you won't be constrained by the mobility and reload speeds that those have. And a big difference between the M4 and the EM2 is that pretty much anyone can use the M4 and do good with it, whereas you're gonna have to practice with the EM2 in order to actually use it to begin with. Its TTKs may be great, but its recoil is really not. The M4 is just way easier to use, and honestly, an easy to use weapon shouldn't be that good anyways. I would love for them to buff the M4's mobility, because then it would go from being a pretty decent choice to being an actual good choice. There's a lot of weapons out there that are only good up to 100 meters, but it's hard to tell which one's the best because they all have different things that they're better at, whether it's recoil, mobility, or damage. And the M4 right now is pretty decent at all these things. It's just, it could be a lot better. So if you want a pretty decent weapon that you can use at most situations, then try out the M4. But if you need a bit more range, you're gonna have to try something else. So that's the M4. Have you used it recently? And if so, what'd you think about it? And if there's any weapon, build, or part of the game you want to break down, let me know. You may see it on the next Community Wednesday. But if you enjoyed the video or it's helped you in any way, let me know by leaving a like. If you got any questions or comments, leave them down in the comment section down below. And if you want to make sure that you never miss another video, be sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching.